What's up everyone? Today we have a pull day on the cards. So that is literally the exact opposite to the push day that we did earlier. So we'll be focusing on our back, our biceps and our rear delts, or the back of our shoulders. Before we get started, I'd just like to thank those of you who checked out my first YouTube video. It was, like I said in that video, it was definitely a lot harder than I anticipated. So the learnings and the feedback I got from that, I'm hopefully going to successfully be able to transfer onto this video. So the first exercise we've got for our pull day is what I call a rear delt V fly. I don't know if there's probably actually a proper name for it, but that's kind of what I named it. And basically what we're doing is we're sitting down at the end of a bench, we'll be hinged over and we'll be flying the dumbbells back in a V shape. This exercise is primarily targeting our rear delts. We also might get like a little bit of traps and stuff involved there too, but ideally we're trying to prioritize the rear delts. When we hinge over, we don't really want to be dipping our chest up and down a lot or excessively too much, because if we're doing that too much, obviously we're helping from our mid back to help pull those dumbbells up. And as well, like I said, you will get a little bit of traps, but ideally we're not just trying to shrug our way through it. Alright, now our next movement is a pretty classic or old school kind of exercise, I guess, and that's our bent over row with a barbell. The bent over row with a barbell isn't something I typically include in my normal training. Just while I've been training at home, I've been including it. Normally I'll probably go for more of a machine variation, or something that sort of allows for a better alignment, and also something I could do maybe even single-sided, like dumbbell seal rows or something. But even so, especially at home, this is still a really good back building exercise. The first thing we have to consider is our setup. So how we sort of position ourselves to get the most out of our bent over row. And what that's going to look like is our feet roughly hip width apart, or somewhere where it's kind of comfortable for you. I just wouldn't go excessively wide or excessively narrow. From there we'll hinge over, so that involves pushing your hips back and then bringing your torso down, but keeping your chest up. So we don't want to see that you're rounding over, we want to see that you're hinging over from the hips. And then from there we'll make sure abs are tight, glutes are tight. And then for our sequence, it's quite important what order we do things, I guess. And the order that we really want to see is that our shoulder blades move first, then our elbows follow, and then lastly our hands move. And it's going to look like one fluid motion, but there's a big difference between moving everything from your shoulder blades first versus moving your hands first. And the biggest difference is that moving from your shoulder blades first, you're making your back fire first or contract first. So we're more likely to be using our back muscles to do the moving instead of like our biceps or our forearms if we were to go from our hands first. And another thing as well, if we move from our shoulder blades first instead of our hands, then we're less likely to round over at the top. We're less likely to see this kind of happen. So basically, if you want to target your back muscles more, try go shoulder blades, elbows, and then wrists when you're rowing it up. So our next one, pretty similar to a bent over row, but a few key sort of differences, that instead of prioritizing muscle groups like our lats and our rhomboids and stuff, I guess we're making the movement more about our rear delts and a little bit more upper traps. So the main setup differences between this and our bent over row is obviously our forehead is on the bench and our elbows are going to be coming out in a wider position, more like this, as opposed to sort of a 45-degree angle, I guess. And with our head on the bench, this is a movement I've sort of only been doing for maybe the past month or two, so I haven't exactly mastered it, but I guess I got a good grasp on it. So with our head on the bench, it means that we're less likely to lift our torso up and down, because obviously if we did that, our head would come off the bench. And because we're not lifting our torso up and down, we're less likely to use our mid back and also our lower back. So everything is going to stay stationary, abs tight, glutes tight, not rounding like we said for our bent over row. And then from there, it's the same sort of sequence as our bent over row in terms of how we want to be moving that weight. So the shoulder blades will still come back first, followed by the elbows and then the hands. Just so that way, again, we can sort of get everything in our upper back, so thinking traps and rear delts mainly, so we can get those sort of moving the weight first and doing the most work, instead of, again, using our forearms and our biceps to take over the movement. Traps are a muscle group, like particularly upper traps, because they go from quite high up on your shoulders all the way down, and then it's different for everyone, but they can extend quite far down your back, maybe about a third of the way down. They're a muscle group that I think I really need to sort of prioritize more, because the way that I train and the way I like to coach people to train is to not allow the traps to take over, because when we're stressed in particular, that's a muscle group that can be contracted by our shoulders lifting up. So often when we're training, they just commonly take over, even in like a lateral raise or like a tricep push down, we can really see the traps coming up. And because for so long I've been trying to not use my traps, I think they actually need some isolated work, and that's why I've started to incorporate a bit more shrugging movements into my pull days. And the one that I have supersetted with today is the slightly bent over barbell shrug. And I like to do it just slightly hinged over instead of like standing up straight like this, just to get a bit more traps involved. So instead of it just being like all upper traps, a slight hinge forward can allow us just to recruit a bit more traps further down, sort of more towards the middle part of our traps, I guess. And then with this one, it's literally all about how high can we get our shoulders up. So really trying to lift those shoulders, and even at the top, I kind of try and bring my elbows up and bend them a little bit, just to get a little bit more out of the movement. But I mean, it's pretty simple. Main things we want to avoid again is that rounding or any excessive movement through our torso. Alright, and lastly we've got our biceps, and man, this is a superset that I did when I first started the gym when I was maybe 14 or 15, and it was when I first learnt about 21s. And 21s, bicep curl 21s, what they are is a matrix set, and basically what that means is that we're breaking down the full rep range into segments, and in this case we're breaking it down into 3 different segments, and that is the top segment, the full segment, and the bottom. So basically, like, I mark each part of that movement by the 90-degree bend at the elbows. So the top is from the top of the range down to 90 degrees, and then the bottom is from full extension up to 90 degrees, and then obviously our full rep is our full rep. And typically how I explain a full range in a bicep curl is basically full extension of the elbows. If you've got hyperextending joints, I wouldn't sort of force it too much, but the arms should basically be straight, and then we should be aiming to come up pretty close to our chin. Obviously we're not going to smack it, but we're going to come up pretty close to it. And then on the way down, we're reaching nice and long with our arms. One key thing we want to avoid is what I touched on before with the traps. A common error that I see quite often around the gym is that people allow their traps to get involved in the movement. And normally, like where I see that happening is from the top portion. So when your hands are at the top of the movement, it seems that people allow their traps to kick in as the hands start to come down. So we really want to try and avoid that, and at the bottom too, obviously. We're just trying our best to keep those traps down and out of the movement, so then we're allowing it to stay in our biceps a little bit more. And then as well as that, the reaching long kind of aspect I touched on, that's basically instead of bringing that bar down really close to our body, because in doing that, it obviously takes the load off the biceps a little bit, because the further the load away is from ourselves, the more it's going to stay in the biceps. So we want to be reaching long instead of sort of keeping it really close to our body. And then obviously we've got the swinging back and forth. Ideally we want to try and keep that to a minimum. We will, like, it can be almost inevitable that you incorporate a tiny bit of swinging, but that might be when you're sort of towards the end range, or maybe you're trying to get some forced reps out. But like for the most part, abs should be nice and tight, shoulder blades should be back and down, glutes are tight, so that ideally it's just going to be all coming from our biceps. And then the last sort of minor detail to consider is the amount of wrist flexion and extension we're getting like this. Because if we're sort of curling down and then curling up like this, we're going to be using a lot of our forearms. So if we keep our wrists straight, then it's more likely we're going to be using our biceps. Our last exercise for our pull day is going to be our dumbbell hammer curls. And the tips that we used for our easy bar curls, our 21s, they're basically going to transfer over exactly the same. Now the only difference is going to be our hand position. So instead of being on an easy bar like this, they'll be with dumbbells in a neutral position like this. And the tips that transfer over are in terms of mainly our body positioning and keeping our traps down. So we want to stay relatively straight, like not swinging too much. So glutes tight, abs tight, and then keep those traps down as much as we can. So we don't want to see them coming up or our shoulders rolling over like that. And now specifically for the hammer curls in that neutral grip position, as we're curling, when we come to the top here, we want to see that that dumbbell is vertical. Because if we come too high up and we come to here, it's basically like a resting position. It doesn't place a lot of load on the bicep because it's basically just pushing straight down. So we want to keep it vertical and slightly sort of away from our shoulder like this. We just sort of recap the exercises that we did, and now the exercises that I chose today isn't necessarily the only way you can do a pull day. I probably would do it a little bit differently if I was training in the gym, but at home I find structuring my pull day like this, it just worked really well for me, and it was exercises that I enjoyed doing. So we started off with our rear delt V fly sitting on the bench, so that's our rear delts. Next we did our bent over row, and that's mainly for our lats and sort of everything that moves our shoulder blades. And then we did our head supported row, which is primarily rear delts and traps. And then we supersetted that with our shrugs, so that's primarily traps, pretty much all traps. And then we finished off with our superset between our easy bar curl 21, so going 7 reps in each of the 3 ranges. And we supersetted that with our dumbbell hammer curls, remembering the difference between that is the peak and then the thickness we get in our hammer curls. And then the main tips sort of throughout all of the movements, I guess, is our posture, so keeping our chest up nice and tall, and then for our rowing movements, leading from the shoulder blades, and then for our movements like our curls, trying to stay up nice and straight, so not excessively swinging, and then not allowing the traps to ride up or the shoulders to roll over. Thanks so much again for checking out this video. I intend to make some more content when I get into the gym too, so hope you look forward to that, and I'll see you again soon.